The summer of 1863 along the Mississippi River was heavy with heat and humidity, the thick air carrying the scent of wet soil and the ever-present river. Towns and settlements had been quietened by war, yet a new, creeping fear had begun to grip the banks of the great river. It was not the sound of gunfire that disturbed the night, nor the approach of Union or Confederate soldiers. It was something else, something slower, deliberate, and chilling. Locals whispered of a presence that moved along the riverbanks after dusk, a shadow that lingered long after its source had vanished, leaving only fear in its wake. The first reports were simple enough, dismissed by many as the imagination of rivermen or the exaggerations of weary soldiers. A ferryman claimed that he had seen a figure along the shore near Vicksburg, a tall, lean man whose features were obscured by darkness. He said the figure's movements were unnatural and that he felt watched even when the man was out of sight. At first, the story circulated quietly, shared in hushed tones in taverns and trading posts, a tale of caution more than terror. As the weeks passed, the incidents multiplied. Farmers working near the river reported livestock missing or found dead. Strange markings scrawled along fence posts and footprints that began and ended abruptly in the sand. A merchant returning from Natchez described seeing figures that seemed human, yet moved like smoke over the water, their forms stretching and contracting in ways that defied normal motion. By mid-July, the name Shadow Killer began circulating among the river communities, a name whispered with dread and anxiety. Sheriff James Crowe of a small settlement near Yazoo reported his first encounter on a humid evening. He had been patrolling the riverbank, lantern in hand, following a series of disturbances reported by local farmers. As he moved along the bank, the shadows seemed to grow heavier, stretching across the trees and the water's edge. Then he saw it, a man, or something like a man, standing motionless on the bank. Its face was indistinct, and the way it moved was deliberate, careful, almost rehearsed. Before Crowe could approach, it vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but the chill of fear and the faint impression that he had been watched for hours. The killings themselves were gradual, almost ritualistic in their execution. Victims were found along the banks, each scene marked by a careful arrangement that seemed deliberate to those who discovered it. No ordinary criminal had been seen. No one heard the victim's final moments. Men, women, and occasionally children were found in secluded areas along the river, the bodies often contorted, hands clutching at the earth as if resisting something unseen. The coroner could find no consistent cause of death. Some showed wounds that suggested a struggle, others none at all. The only constant was the shadow, described by witnesses as a tall, indistinct figure that lingered near the water, always observing. Rumors spread faster than any official report. Some said the killer was a fugitive, a soldier gone rogue in the chaos of the Civil War, taking advantage of the scattered settlements. Others whispered of darker things, of curses, of the river itself claiming lives through a human instrument. Women who drew water from the river at night swore they could feel eyes upon them, subtle movements in the corner of vision that disappeared when directly observed. Children refused to play near the river after dusk, their laughter replaced with silent glances toward the shadows at the water's edge. Sheriff Crowe, determined to bring the killer to justice, organized a night patrol with several volunteers. Lanterns cut through the humid darkness, and the men moved cautiously along the bank, rifles raised, ears straining for the slightest sound. For hours, nothing happened. Then, as the river reflected the pale moonlight, a figure appeared on the opposite bank, still and tall, watching. Crowe raised his lantern, but the figure vanished, leaving behind only an unnatural chill and the soft rippling of water where the body should have been. One of the men swore he saw footprints form in the sand for a moment, only to vanish before anyone could step on them. The psychological toll was immediate. Townspeople became paranoid, moving only in groups, avoiding the river at night. Rumors of the shadow killer's abilities grew. Some said he could stretch his body through the darkness, appear and disappear at will, or move without leaving any trace. Others dismissed such claims, attributing them to the collective fear that war and disease had already instilled in the region. Yet no one could deny the steady pattern of deaths and disappearances. By August, reports came from settlements further down River Natchez, Vicksburg, and even smaller hamlets along tributaries. Each report followed the same pattern: sudden disappearances, bodies found in strange positions, footprints that did not make sense, and an inescapable sense of being observed. In towns still occupied by soldiers, some speculated that the killer was a Confederate deserter. Others thought him a vengeful spirit born of the river's violence. But no evidence tied him to any known identity, and those who tried to track him were left with confusion and dread. The local press began covering the story, though cautiously. Editors emphasized that nothing could be confirmed, but the reports were too numerous to ignore. Letters poured in from farmers, boatmen, and merchants describing encounters that defied reason. Shadows that moved independently of light, figures appearing on riverbanks where no one should be, the oppressive feeling of unseen eyes. Each report contributed to the legend, and the moniker, Shadow Killer, solidified in the collective imagination of the Mississippi River Valley. By fall, authorities were desperate. Teams of trackers, armed men, and local guides were sent on missions to intercept the killer. They followed footprints in the sand, investigated abandoned cabins, and scoured the river banks under lantern light. Every mission returned empty-handed, though each participant reported moments of unease hearing steps behind them that ceased when turned, glimpsing dark figures among trees, feeling sudden drops in temperature in areas otherwise unaffected. The killings continued through the autumn, but the pattern shifted. Bodies were no longer found near settlements, but deeper along isolated stretches of riverbank, often in dense fog or heavy mist. Witnesses described encountering the figure at dawn, standing silently by the water, as if observing the river itself. No one could explain why the killer seemed drawn to these remote areas, or how he evaded detection so completely. By winter, the cold and flooding of the river temporarily slowed activity, but tales persisted of dark shapes slipping along the icy banks, never caught, always watching. The following winter was harsh, the Mississippi swollen with icy currents and drifting debris, but the shadow killer did not pause. Reports became sporadic as the cold kept most townspeople indoors, yet the fear lingered like a dense fog over the river valley. Farmers who ventured out to check on livestock found unsettling signs: footprints in frozen mud that ended abruptly, fences broken as if by unseen hands, and animals trembling as though aware of a hidden predator. Children whispered of seeing dark figures in the distance, their voices trembling, while adults laughed nervously, trying to reassure themselves that imagination had merely overtaken reason. Sheriff Crowe refused to believe in mere superstition. He and a small party of men patrolled the banks daily, following the river's winding course, carrying lanterns and firearms. On one frigid evening, they stumbled upon a campfire still smoldering, though no one was present. Surrounding the fire were signs of a struggle: footprints scattered around, marks on tree trunks, and a trail leading directly into the thick forest bordering the river. Crowe attempted to follow the path, but the snow and mist made it impossible to track. When he returned the next day, the trail was gone, erased by wind and drifting snow. It was as if the river itself had swallowed all evidence. Farmers and boatmen began altering their routines. Ferries crossed the river only in daylight, and trading posts kept doors bolted before sunset. Rumors of the shadow killer's abilities grew increasingly elaborate. Some claimed he could appear in multiple places at once. Others said he could stretch his shadow along the water to reach victims without being seen. Stories were told in hushed tones at taverns, and even seasoned soldiers admitted to avoiding stretches of riverbank after dusk. The terror had become collective, a psychological contagion that spread faster than the manhunt itself. In late January, a young fisherman named Thomas Beckwith claimed a close encounter. He described leaving his small skiff to check nets near a bend in the river, only to notice a dark figure standing on the shore. The figure did not move at first, yet Beckwith felt an overwhelming sense of observation. When he raised his lantern, the figure vanished, leaving footprints in the wet sand that appeared to shimmer and fade, as though the water itself had absorbed them. Beckwith later swore that he could feel the figure's presence behind him for hours, even after he returned home. By spring, reports indicated that the shadow killer had become more methodical. Victims were found farther from settlements, often in isolated groves or abandoned cabins. Their deaths were quiet, the cause sometimes inexplicable. One man was discovered on a sandbar, curled as if in sleep, with no wounds. Another woman's body was found beneath a willow tree, fingers clutching at grass, her expression one of wide-eyed terror. The coroner's reports reflected confusion and frustration. No weapon, no struggle, nothing to explain the deaths except the faint impressions of shadows observed by witnesses before the bodies were found. Crowe organized a large-scale investigation with several volunteers, hoping to finally intercept the killer. They established patrols along miles of riverbank, coordinated watch rotations, and left markers to track any movement. Nights were long and tense, the thick mist and heavy foliage giving the landscape a dreamlike, almost unreal quality. For hours nothing happened, until one patrol reported a series of footprints forming a circle around their campfire. The impressions were precise, as if the killer had deliberately tested the boundaries. When the man approached, the footprints vanished into the mud, leaving only the oppressive feeling of being watched. Stories from this period describe the psychological strain on the townspeople. Sleep became difficult. Shadows in homes, flickering lantern light, and sounds outside were all amplified by fear. People avoided the river entirely after dark, and even those tasked with night watches often deserted their posts after experiencing fleeting glimpses of the dark figure or unexplained movements. One woman described hearing whispers along the riverbank, voices in the mist, soft but urgent, calling names she did not recognize. Others claimed to have glimpsed a figure that moved like smoke, its form stretching and twisting unnaturally along the shoreline. By June 1863, the shadow killer had become an almost mythical presence. His activity was documented in letters to newspapers, in personal journals, and in oral accounts passed between settlements. Each description varied slightly, yet all shared a common element. A tall, indistinct figure that appeared and vanished without warning, leaving death, fear, and confusion in its wake. Some witnesses attempted to set traps, stake out cabins, or lure the figure into ambushes, but each attempt ended with frustration and unease. No one ever captured him, and the killer seemed to anticipate every move. The toll on local law enforcement was severe. Sheriff Crowe and his deputies reported sleep deprivation, irritability, and paranoia. Crowds gathered during daylight to share rumors and experiences, and the sense of collective fear intensified. Men who had once been skeptical found themselves walking riverbanks with rifles at night, hearts racing at every ripple in the water, every rustle of leaves. The psychological imprint of the killer grew, so that even in sunlight, residents spoke of unease, watching for shadows that did not exist, listening for sounds carried across the river. Descriptions of the shadow killer during this period were eerily consistent in some respects. Witnesses spoke of a figure clad in dark clothing, tall and lean, with indistinct features, often moving silently along the riverbank or standing motionless for hours. His presence was accompanied by subtle changes, a chill in the air, the faint rustling of trees without wind, and the fleeting impression of footprints that appeared and vanished as if the ground had absorbed them. These details, repeated by multiple independent observers, lent credibility to the otherwise unbelievable accounts. In July, a group of soldiers stationed along the river attempted a coordinated hunt. Lanterns lit the banks, rifles at the ready, men moving in tight formation. Hours passed with only the sound of the river and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, in a narrow bend of the river, a shadow appeared. Witnesses described it as taller than a man, moving with an unnatural grace. When they approached, it vanished into the mist. Only afterward did they discover footprints leading to a small shack, arranged meticulously, as though left for them to follow. But when they entered, the shack was empty, and nothing remained but the lingering sense of observation. By late summer, the killings and disappearances began to taper slightly. The shadow killer had become selective, avoiding settlements where patrols were strong, striking in isolated areas with little chance of intervention. People who had fled to higher ground or inland reported fewer sightings, but the legend continued to grow. Children whispered tales of the dark figure moving silently along the water's edge. Farmers avoided the river after dark, and travelers along the Mississippi altered their routes to minimize exposure. Even years later, after the Civil War ended and some semblance of normalcy returned, the story of the shadow killer persisted. The deaths, the missing, and the fleeting observations became part of local folklore. Historians, scholars, and writers attempting to examine the events found themselves confronted with fragmented reports, inconsistent eyewitness accounts, and a pervasive sense of unease. Some concluded that a criminal had used the river's geography and the cover of darkness to commit murders, while others suggested that fear itself had magnified every shadow, every movement into something almost supernatural. By autumn 1863, the Mississippi River Valley had been transformed by fear. The shadow killer's presence was no longer a distant rumor. It had become a constant looming threat in the minds of the townspeople. Fishermen, ferry operators, and even soldiers moving along the river reported encounters that defied ordinary explanation. Some described figures moving with unnatural slowness, their shapes stretching along the river bank in ways that made the mind question perception. Others noticed the shadows lingered, even when the figure had vanished, clinging to trees, river bends, and abandoned cabins, as though marking territory or observing long after the killer had moved on. Sheriff Crowe organized what would become the most coordinated pursuit yet. Teams of men patrolled the river in shifts, lanterns casting long beams of light across the misty waters and fog-laden banks. Observers were instructed to record every detail: footprints, disturbances, abandoned camps, and most importantly, any sign of the killer. But even with dozens of men involved, the shadow killer proved elusive. Patrols often returned with footprints leading into thick woods or vanishing on river sandbars, as if the land itself conspired to hide him. One night, a patrol discovered an abandoned cabin on a remote bend of the river. The door hung ajar, the interior in immaculate order despite the harsh weather. Tools stacked neatly, food carefully placed on a table, a journal left open on the floor. No human presence remained, yet the men reported an immediate sense of being watched. One of the soldiers claimed he saw a shadow move across the river outside, but when he aimed his lantern, nothing was there. They left markers in the snow, hoping to follow a trail, only to find it erased by morning frost and drifting mist. Residents along the river became increasingly isolated. Families no longer drew water after dusk. Ferries ceased night crossings. Children refused to play near the banks, and merchants delayed trips to nearby towns. Even those with experience in the wilderness admitted to unease. A veteran soldier stationed near Vicksburg wrote in his journal, "The air carries a weight, a presence unseen, a constant watching. No man is safe, and even the bravest are held in thrall by what moves in shadow." Several accounts suggested that the killer had developed a methodical approach. Victims were found in locations removed from the river's main paths, sometimes in dense thickets or on small islands hidden by fog. Their deaths were sudden and often inexplicable. Strangulation, blunt force, or simply discovered lifeless without a mark. Some witnesses noted subtle, eerie signs, footprints circling a victim's body, items arranged carefully nearby, and invariably the fleeting glimpse of a tall, dark figure standing silently at a distance. These patterns seemed deliberate, as if the killer orchestrated not just the deaths, but the terror surrounding them. Sheriff Crowe's own experience became the most unnerving. On a late October evening, he and two deputies patrolled near an isolated bend. The fog rolled thickly across the water, obscuring the moon. Suddenly, a figure emerged at the edge of their lantern light, impossibly tall, lean, and motionless. Crowe advanced, shouting and raising his rifle, but the figure dissolved into the mist, leaving behind only footprints that ended abruptly. Even more disquieting, the deputies reported seeing shadows stretching unnaturally along the riverbank, reaching toward the men as if probing, yet when they moved to confront them, nothing was there. Crowe recorded in his journal a growing belief that the killer was intimately familiar with the landscape, capable of using shadows and terrain to his advantage in ways that defied conventional logic. Local newspapers began publishing accounts, though they treated the events with caution. Reports emphasized disappearances, mysterious deaths, and eyewitness testimonies of dark figures, but editors avoided sensational claims, attempting to preserve credibility. Despite this, the legend of the shadow killer spread, reaching neighboring states along the Mississippi. Travelers and boatmen passing through recounted tales of strange figures along the river, and the collective fear among communities only deepened. By November, bodies continued to appear in isolated areas. One man was found beneath a willow tree, his expression frozen in terror, his arms outstretched as if reaching for something unseen. Another woman was discovered in a cabin with the hearth cold, her hands clutching the floorboards. In each case, townsfolk reported that shadows lingered nearby, sometimes on riverbanks, sometimes in trees, vanishing when approached, yet leaving a palpable sensation of observation. Some residents speculated that the killer was a deserter from the war, a man trained in stealth and survival, exploiting the chaos of conflict. Others whispered of darker possibilities, that he was driven by a psychological compulsion, or even that the Mississippi itself lent him power, guiding him to isolated victims. Regardless of explanation, the pattern was undeniable. No community was truly safe, no journey along the river untroubled by fear. Sheriff Crowe continued his patrols into the winter months, weary and haunted. He recorded nights spent listening to footsteps on the frozen river, seeing fleeting forms along the banks, and feeling chills that seemed to follow him despite heavy coats and lanterns. His notes reveal a man on the edge of obsession, convinced that the killer was not merely human, but intimately tied to the river, using its curves, islands, and fog as both ally and shield. The culmination of the terror occurred in late December. A group of 3 men, including Crowe, followed footprints leading to a small sandbar. The fog was thick, the river silent except for faint lapping at the shore. There they saw him, or what appeared to be him. A tall figure, features obscured, standing motionless and watching. As they advanced, the figure seemed to stretch and lean, moving unnaturally, then vanished entirely. The men searched for hours, finding nothing except footprints that ended abruptly in sand and mud. Crowe later wrote, "We were close, yet he was gone, leaving only the echo of our fear behind." By early 1864, sightings became less frequent. Some believed the shadow killer had moved further downstream, others that he had been killed or had simply disappeared. The river's edge remained haunted by rumors and fear, and even decades later, travelers reported glimpses of dark figures in misty bends, strange footprints, and a lingering sense of observation. Historians later attributed many incidents to heightened paranoia, psychological strain, and wartime chaos. Yet the pattern of unexplained deaths and vanishings defied complete explanation. The legend endured in folklore, tales of the shadow killer passed down from generation to generation along the Mississippi. Fishermen, boatmen, and river communities spoke of the tall, silent figure that moved like smoke, leaving death and dread in its wake. Children were warned not to play near the river at night, and adults remembered the eerie chill that accompanied the river after sunset. The killer became a symbol of the river's unpredictability, the danger of isolation, and the human mind's vulnerability to fear. Even in modern accounts, the story is recounted with a mixture of fascination and unease. Archaeologists and historians can reconstruct the river's geography, examine eyewitness accounts, and consider socio-political context, yet the figure's elusiveness and the pattern of fear remain. The Mississippi River in 1863 was a corridor of life, commerce, and war, but also of a terror that left no trace, save for stories, footprints that vanished, and the lingering impression of shadows at the water's edge. By the spring of 1864, the Mississippi River had begun to thaw, revealing stretches of sandbars, mudflats, and debris left by the winter's ice. Yet the memory of the shadow killer lingered like a persistent fog, infecting the minds of those who lived along its banks. Survivors of the previous year's terror spoke cautiously, their voices lowered when recounting sightings, vanishings, and the inexplicable deaths that had marked the river. Even children, once oblivious to danger, had absorbed the cautionary tales, refusing to play near the water after dusk, their imagination haunted by the figure their parents spoke of in whispers. Sheriff James Crowe, older and wearier, continued his patrols despite the near-constant fatigue that had settled in his bones. Each day brought new reports, though less frequent than in the height of the killings. He observed with growing unease that the river itself seemed to retain an echo of past terror. Footprints appearing and vanishing, shadows stretching unnaturally across banks and trees, and the lingering sensation of being watched. He began to suspect that the killer's methods were intertwined with the geography of the river itself. That familiarity with the fog, bends, and hidden coves had made him nearly impossible to apprehend. The final series of killings, occurring in late March, brought both horror and clarity. A group of 3 young men returning from a logging expedition upriver discovered a shallow grave beneath the roots of a cypress tree. The body, a farmer known for tending lands along the opposite bank, showed no sign of struggle, but bore an expression of terror frozen in his features. Nearby, items, tools, a satchel, and papers were arranged with deliberate care. No footprints led away from the scene, though the soil bore impressions consistent with human movement. Witnesses later reported a dark figure standing silently in the fog, watching the grave, before disappearing as they approached. In another case, a ferry operator found a woman's body near a bend in the river, partially submerged. Her clothing was wet, heavy with mud, yet there were no wounds to indicate the cause of death. Footprints leading to her body were clearly visible, but vanished suddenly in the mud, as if absorbed by the earth itself. When he called for help, a shadow appeared on the opposite bank, tall and motionless, its presence unrelenting, though the operator could not describe a face or form in detail. It vanished before anyone could approach. By this point, the communities along the Mississippi had adapted to fear. Farmers traveled in pairs or small groups. Ferries and boats avoided isolated sections of river. Lanterns were lit constantly during evening hours. Night patrols became ritualized, with volunteers taking shifts along the banks, marking locations of disturbances and documenting every anomaly. And yet, the shadow killer continued to elude capture. He was never cornered, never forced into confrontation. His presence persisted as a ghostly, silent observer, leaving only traces of movement, carefully arranged belongings, and the lingering terror of being watched. Sheriff Crowe himself documented the final direct encounter with the killer in a journal entry dated April 10th, 1864. He wrote, "We saw him, or what I believe to be him, standing upon a sandbar beneath the moonlight. Tall, silent, featureless, he watched us for what seemed like hours. We advanced, calling his name, aiming rifles, yet he vanished before our eyes. Only the footprints remained, abruptly ending at the edge of water where no man could have stood. I cannot say what manner of man he is, only that he moves as though the river itself is his ally." The killings gradually ceased after that spring. Scholars and locals debated why. Some believed the killer had finally left the region, moving to new, isolated stretches of the Mississippi. Others speculated that age, illness, or injury had claimed him. Rumors persisted that he had been captured or killed in a skirmish unrelated to the river, yet no evidence ever confirmed this. The deaths, the vanishings, and the eerie sightings had slowed, but the memory of his presence endured, etched into the collective consciousness of the communities along the river. Over the following years, settlers and travelers recounted stories in hushed tones, describing dark figures glimpsed in mist, shadows that stretched unnaturally across banks, and the unsettling feeling of being observed along the water's edge. Children grew up with warnings about the river, told to stay close to home after dusk. Fishermen and boatmen spoke of moments when the air suddenly grew cold and reflections in the water appeared distorted, as if mirroring forms that were not there. Even long after the final recorded killings, the Mississippi retained its reputation as a river that concealed secrets, where shadows moved with purpose and observation was constant. Historical records compiled decades later show a mix of fact and folklore. Coroner's reports noted unexplained deaths. Letters and journals preserved eyewitness accounts. Newspaper articles documented patterns of vanishings. Scholars debated whether the shadow killer was a single man, a deserter, a murderer, or a collective psychological phenomenon amplified by isolation, fog, and wartime paranoia. Some argued that the pattern of deaths and the consistency of eyewitness descriptions could not be dismissed entirely. The shadowy figure, whatever or whoever he was, had left an indelible mark on the river valley. Communities along the Mississippi adapted to his legacy. Paths and routines changed. Ferry operations were scheduled only during daylight, and families restricted travel after dark. In quiet moments, townspeople would recall fleeting glimpses of the figure, the sensation of unseen eyes, and the impressions of footprints that ended mysteriously. These memories persisted, a reminder that the river's vastness, its fog, and its hidden coves could conceal even the most calculated predator. By the end of the 19th century, the shadow killer had become legend. Writers, historians, and folklorists collected tales, piecing together accounts into narratives of a tall, silent figure moving along the Mississippi, leaving death and unease in his wake. While the identity and fate of the killer remained unknown, the pattern of terror, the precise arrangement of victims and items, and the chilling reports of lingering shadows created a story that would endure far longer than any single lifetime. Even today, travelers along the Mississippi recount stories passed down for generations. A chill in the air, shadows moving unnaturally along river bends, and the overwhelming sense that the river observes those who traverse it. Though no killings have been documented for over a century, the river carries memory, and the legend of the shadow killer remains a psychological imprint, a cautionary tale, and an enduring mystery of the Mississippi in 1863. The shadow killer, whether man, specter, or product of collective fear, achieved what few could: an invisible dominion over a vast, wild landscape. He moved silently, struck unpredictably, and vanished without trace, leaving communities forever altered. His story is a testament to the interplay of human psychology, isolation, and the unforgiving nature of the Mississippi River. A reminder that some mysteries, though rooted in reality, can never be fully explained. In the end, the Mississippi itself remains the final witness. The bends, the fog, the silent banks, these bear the imprint of the shadow killer, an unseen predator whose methods, motivations, and identity were never known. And in the quiet hours, when the wind rustles through cypress trees, and the river laps softly at the shore, the echo of that presence lingers still, a shadow on the water, watching, waiting, and unforgotten.